All right, I think we have a good and healthy amount of people already on the call. I don't want to delay it any further for the people that have time-sensitive meetings following this call. So let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Philipp Schmid. I'm going to be your host for this webinar. With me on the call, we have Philipp Melab. That is our lead engineer at Amazing Labs, and he'll lead us through the webinar titled Test-Driven Development with Storybook and Cypress.io. Before we get into the presentation, we have a tiny bit of housekeeping to do quickly. So please feel free to ask any questions at any time throughout the webinar by using the Q&A function that is at the bottom center of your Zoom window. And we will dedicate some extra time to all open questions at the end in a summarizing Q&A session. That is a live Q&A with Philipp. And also, should you drop out of this call at any time, you'll be able to catch up on everything that you've missed in a full recording of this session that we'll be sharing with all attendees within the next couple of days. Also, if you are joining us today for the first time and you're interested in more content in our test-driven development series, check out our YouTube channel for the previous webinars in this series. I'll be sharing a link to that one with you in the chat shortly. Alrighty, without any further ado, I think we should be opening up the floor for today's speaker. Over to you, Philipp.
Thank you very much, Philipp. And also welcome from my side, and thank you for joining the third webinar in our test-driven development series. And we're going to kick this issue off with a recap of the first two webinars. So in the first one, we were looking at using Cypress.io together with Drupal to build your Drupal websites and administration backends, using the Drupal module for Cypress. And we also learned why testing is important in an agile-driven process, and why you are essentially counting piles of donkey poop if you measure your velocity on untested features. And in the second webinar, we baited you into joining by assembling two of the biggest buzzwords in current web development into one webinar title, because we stated it would be about Gatsby and Cypress.io, which it eventually was, but since Gatsby and Cypress paired together that effortlessly, we filled up the webinar with a lesson about behavior-driven development and how to write proper scenarios, apply the right amount of detail, and when to write scenarios, by whom scenarios should be written to make them more a tool of communication than just a tool of testing and automating tests. And this level of abstraction implies that these tests don't contain every little detail of your project, of your requirements. Like your test scenario states that a user submits a form and then something should happen in your system, but the scenario should actually not explicitly describe in all detail what colors the button should have and where it should be displayed. Why? Because this is essentially implementation detail that should happen on a different level. And a lot of my project managers ask me, okay, where do we state these details? And the right answer is you don't, because it's not a product owner's or project manager's job to tell you which color a button should have. It's the job of the UX and design expert. And this person in an agile workflow should actually be part of the team. So how does it look like, and how exactly is a functionality implemented is part of the development workflow that happens after defining scenarios. So if we look at our testing pyramid again, that we've already seen in the first webinar. There are the automated end-to-end tests and also integration tests, which we largely covered in the first two webinars using Cypress. And then there are the automated component and unit tests, which happen on a much lower level. And these are the ones that are supposed to cover these details. So to look at a more detailed differentiation, what is an integration test or an acceptance test, as we've done them? Integration tests ensure that whole business requirements are met. They protect us against regressions during development on the long term. They provide documentation. If you do behavior-driven development the right way, your tests actually should be written in a way that a QA expert, a product owner, a client are able to read them and then, based on them, manually test their system. But compared to unit tests, they are glacially slow. And test coverage reporting actually means nothing, because in a full stack integration test where we load the whole website at once, we could technically use our coverage tooling to generate test coverage for every line of code that has been invoked. But for most parts of the code that is executed, we only know that it did not raise a fatal error. Because if we load a website and we test one specific functionality, but it also contains a login area on the top and a sidebar menu and an email submit form, a newsletter submit form in the footer area, none of these components are actually tested. We only know that they did not fail fatally. Unit tests, on the other hand, are actually a developer's tool. They're there to make you fast during every stage of development. That's why unit tests should also be written during development and during every development cycle. As we've seen in the first webinar, the cycle of test-driven development is write a failing test, so you know that you have to write code. Then write enough code to fix that test. And when the test is green, refactor and then start your cycle again. This might feel slow, but it's actually a lot faster than writing code, manually testing, writing it again, manually testing everything again. So it allows us to move at very high speed, but it can't guarantee the whole system's correctness, as outlined by my favorite GIF on the right-hand side. Because all unit tests pass, you can't be sure that the whole system is operational. That's what the integration tests are there to tell you. And one important part of unit tests, in my opinion, is that coverage actually means something. It does not tell you if your system is completely correct just because you've covered every line of your code with unit tests, but it gives you an indication of how fast you will be able to iterate on your code, because you don't have to test manually and you're less likely to run into unforeseen regressions if you've applied test-driven development upfront properly. At this point, I have to tell you that you have been clickbaited again. The initial title for the webinar was stated test-driven development with Storybook and Cypress. During coming up with the content and structuring content of this webinar, it turned out that Storybook alone at this point already fills up the webinar well enough. And I would like to apologize to everybody who was really looking into learning something new about Cypress. But we're closer looking at now is filling the gaps in our test-driven process that Cypress does not cover or is does not cover that easily and effortlessly as Storybook potentially can. Okay, so a quick primer on Storybook. What is it and what is it not? So Storybook is a tool to organize and showcase visual components and quickly develop and combine them and test them under different circumstances in a very predictable way. It acts as a rapid prototyping tool. It acts as a communication tool to just show single UI elements to clients, to UX experts, collect feedback, and also just provide documentation for the whole team. Storybook is not only for React, although it emerged out of the React ecosystem, but it supports a lot of different templating engines. Then it is not only for building design systems. So a lot of people tell me, okay, yeah, we don't use Storybook because for this project, we don't need to build like a full design system like in Atomic Design Paradigm or whatever. This is not the case. So you don't need to build like a very flexible system. Even if you just want to showcase a handful of pages in different ways, Storybook already helps you, and it already helps you to structure your code properly. And it's also not just for large projects. As just stated, if you have 5 pages that contain listings and that contain a couple of different edge cases to cover, it's already worth the effort, because the effort of getting Storybook into your project is actually rather low. And from our developers' perspective, we can think of Storybook as our unit tests for UI elements that, again, are there to make us faster. And at this point, we're already going to jump into the practical part of our webinar. We're going to start off again where we left off in the last webinar. So we're going to use the same repository. And at the end of the last webinar, we had like a Gatsby website that pulls a list of projects. So it's a mini project management tool from a GraphQL API and displays them as a list. And then you can click there and get to the project's detail overview. So this was the commit added project detail page. That's where we left off. What I now already prepared is I initiated Storybook within this repository, which is very easy. It's one npx command, and you can just get it from the Storybook homepage. So we're not going into that detail. And we added some necessary configuration to make Gatsby and Storybook play well together. You can also find this on the documentation page, on the Gatsby documentation page on how to use Storybook. I actually linked it here in the commit. Okay, and what we're going to do now is just looking at what the Storybook initiation brought us. So we have a Storybook folder with the configuration and a folder called Stories with the first 2 example stories provided by Storybook. And we're just going to start up Storybook. I could have done this before. Okay, here we go. Our example stories. Welcome to Storybook, an emoji button and a text button. So we are going to add our own new story by creating a new file. Projects.stories.js. We're going to import React. And we're going to give our story file a name. And we're going to create our first story. So the default export in a Storybook stories file is this, basically refers to this folder on the right, on the left in the Storybook UI. And below that, there are all the named exports. Project list will be picked up and rendered as stories. So we have our projects page layout, which is just our full projects page that we would like to showcase in Storybook. So projects show up, and our list shows up, but we get an error. The result of this static query could not be fetched. This happens because our projects page layout, the layout component itself, uses a static query. This is a construct by Gatsby, a static query hook to fetch the site meta information and render it into the page. And Storybook has no access to Gatsby's GraphQL API. And it also shouldn't have, because we want to test our UI components in isolation of the data source. So we can be sure that to control how they behave under different circumstances. So what we're going to do now is use a technique called stubbing to replace our invocation of this use static query with a dummy method, but just within Storybook, to be able to simulate its result. We're going to use a JavaScript package called Sign-On to do this. It's a battle-tested library for stubbing, spying, and mocking in JavaScript, and it just works perfectly. And I'm going to jump over the two next commits. So the first one is just installing the sign-on package in our project. And the next one is prepare Storybook for sign-on stubbing. We're going to have a quick look what we did here. In the main Storybook main.js file, we have configured our Babel transpiler, and the Babel transpiler by default will use ES modules, and at least currently Sign-On is not properly able to stub these because they are a browser construct and they're protected from modification in the browser's runtime. So we changed our module directive to CommonJS. So we just use CommonJS modules, and then Sign-On will be able to properly apply the stubbing. And in our preview.js, which is the file that Storybook loads for every story it displays, we're going to add a global decorator that will just call sign-on restore before actually executing the story, which makes sure that every story starts with a fresh set of stubs and spies that we create. Okay, so we're just going to revert our latest changes. And check out this commit. So to be able to swap out our usage of use static query here, we need to move it into a local module. And I think it's generally a good practice to extract React hooks into like local modules to just also be able to properly reuse them. So we're going to create a folder called hooks, and there we create a file called metadata.js. This one is just going to export a function called use metadata. And this function basically just calls what we do here. And I remember that the default Gatsby page uses use static query once again in the SEO component. And here it fetches some additional fields, but we can just also take these over to our common function. And also in SEO.js, we just use our central hook. So the result is still the same because we still use this use static query function. But now within our storybook story, we can just on the fly replace it with an imposter that does what we want it to do. And to do that, we're going to import all as metadata. So we're going to import our new hook module as one object. And then we're going to import the stub function by sign-on. And we're going to stub metadata use metadata function within this module, and we're going to, oh, I think I did something wrong here. This actually just has to call the function directly. No, it doesn't. Oh, it's okay. And this time it should directly return a static result. And we expect site metadata, title, description, author. This has to become a real function, or we won't be able to call our stuff in here. returns, not return. Okay, we're still having a call to use static queries somewhere. Okay, we're just going to check out the next commit and look where the difference was. Nope. Okay, perhaps we're going to restart Storybook, who knows. In the meantime, so this will just result in our next error. Oh yeah, now I know we have to restart Storybook because we changed the Storybook configuration. Totally makes sense. So we stubbed out all the Gatsby GraphQL hooks by now. But we still use our use query hook by the Apollo client. And this also needs to be stubbed. And we use this in projects.js. So here we have use query that just fetches our list of projects, and it does this dynamically in the browser. So we have multiple return states. And we're going to create a new hooks file. And use projects. And it's once again just executing exactly this. And here we use projects instead. And now again, in our stories file, we have to stub out use projects in our projects hook file. At this time, so in the last webinar, when running the GraphQL API with some simulated data, so we could run our end-to-end tests under controlled environments, we already created Cypress fixtures examples.js, which is just a JavaScript file with a list of projects. And we're just directly going to use them to stub out our query results. So we're going to return data. Expecting here data projects. So this should be fine. Oh. Duplication of names here. And on the right-hand side, we see our project management tool properly rendered in Storybook with simulated data. And so what we did now is extract our projects into a separate hook that also can be reused, stub it into our story. And what we're going to do now is add another tool, an add-on to Storybook that is called Story Shots, that essentially creates structure snapshots of all stories that we have in our project and stores them in the Git repository. So we are always able to, when we do modifications, we can run story shots again, and it will do the same snapshots, and it will compare on a textual level if our website structurally changed. And we can test if our changes are intended or not. So in this setup, we installed Jest. We had to do some bubble configuration, add story shots to the preview Jest file, and also add some helper functions to make Jest and Storybook work properly together. But you can just look this up in the commit if you're interested. And we are going to reword our changes once again to jump over these steps. So we checked out set up story shots with Jest. And now we should just be able to run Jest. Any second. And it will pick up essentially one Jest test file that we have now that just calls init story shots. And this will cause Jest to run through all Storybook stories and take snapshots of them. They should appear here. Here they are. So this is just a structural representation of what React would render into our browser window. And if we would now just change a component, so we turn this into an H3. Run Jest again. I edited the wrong file, sorry. Let's turn our unordered list of projects into an ordered one. By the way, this warning is caused by an older version of React Helmet that is in the project. So nothing to worry about at this point. Okay, so here we say, okay, we have a snapshot, but this changed. Are you sure you want this to be changed? Now we could run Jest update snapshots to store this updated version and confirm it. But we're not going to do this now. but we're going to look into something different. So let's check. I want to add another dot to this loading indicator. If I run just now, it passed, even though we changed what our component structurally emitted. So it would be interesting, okay, how do we know if this snapshot testing covered everything? Well, that's where test coverage comes into play. I configured this storyshots.test.js in my IDE just to be able to easily run it in there and also show the coverage information. So I'm going to run this with test coverage. And we see that in our source folder pages, so the page that we're interested in is projects.js, and this is 76% covered. And we see that these three return statements are never executed. Well, because in our projects.stories.js, we just emulate the case that our project list actually returns something. But the great thing that Storybook brings here is that now we can emulate all different states in Storybook too. Close this coverage window again. So what we want this filled state, and we also want the loading state. And in every case, we have to stop out our metadata hook. So we're going to move this into a separate function. To repeat ourselves. Here. Here we do essentially the same thing, but now we're not going to return data, but we're going to return loading is true. Because if we look into this React hook, it returns these three variables and updates them whenever the client-side data fetching by the Apollo client it initiates with loading, and then it either transitions into the error state or the data state, and the component is automatically updated. So we simulate the return of loading true now, and save, and Storybook is live updated. And we can see, oh, this is what our page looks like while it's in the loading state. So we can also look at and style and test our loading state without having to simulate it, or I've already seen developers like adding timeouts into the backend API to be able to see a loading state long enough to test if it's styled or not. That's all gone with this approach. And then we also have an error state. We're going to repeat this. And the error state, if I'm not wrong, expects error to be an object with a message property. We're just going to and now we have our error message. And another edge case that we actually might want to test is an empty list. in this case, we return data projects, but in this time it's an empty array. And this should, according to our source code, display the list, the text, no active projects. But it doesn't. Okay, this means that something is wrong. And what is wrong? We stubbed our project list out with an empty array, and we're just checking for faultiness here. And an empty array in JavaScript is truthy, so we have to add an additional check. So during writing our test, we just discovered a bug. Or so if it's not even there, or if length is 0. And we just fixed our component. And if we run our story shots just with coverage again, we can see that our lines that have been red before are green now. So story shots, so the combination of jest with test coverage and writing stories for all the different states our component can be in, serves two purposes. On the one hand, it allows us to test the different states in isolation and also show them to our UX expert if she has an opinion on how no active projects should actually look like, without having to produce this case in a live environment all the time. And on the other hand, we now have the confidence that our tests covered all different variations of this component. But due to the nature of the web and our best friend CSS, something can still go wrong. Because right now, we know that all our tests pass. So we could also just update our snapshots. To get all these new stories into our snapshot file, so they're actually properly regression tested. But if we just go to layout.css, so there's our front-end developer in the works, and for some reason, we get the idea that EM is going to be bold from now on, and red. So this is definitely a change in our front-end component, in the visual display. But Jest is not going to complain about it because it's not part of the structural snapshot that it does. So we just missed a regression here. That's where we're going to bring the last tool in the chain that my dear colleague, John Elvin Wilkins, pointed out to me. It's called Loki. And it's an open source tool that allows us to take screenshots of all our storybook stories, even in different viewports, from within a Docker container, so it doesn't use different browsers in CI or on local, and can test them, test for visual regressions on a pixel level. And we're going to revert and check out the next commit again to bypass the npm install. And go to the point where we added and configured Loki. Oops, and now I have to start Docker. That's something I forgot before. No, I'm not going to install this update. So the Loki installation is like really, really easy. It's literally yarn add Loki dev and then Loki init, and Loki init will already inject itself into the Storybook preview.js. And it also adds Loki configuration that you can then adjust. And now we can just run yarn Loki, which is going to fire up the Docker container. And it created a host of snapshots of the stories that we have in our in Storybook. So we have our projects page in the empty state, in the error state, and also when displayed on an iPhone, for example. So now we're going to do this change again before. And if we run Loki now, it is going to complain about visual changes that happened in the meantime. Even though the structure of our component didn't change, what Loki renders has changed. And it in the .loki folder, you will have like the reference images, which are the ones that you want to commit to your repository. So the next developer that does changes can test against them. And then there is the current version and the ones that had differences. So we are using the EM tag in our empty error and loading messages. And it shows us a visual different screenshot of what is obviously wrong. And with this tool as the last piece in our chain, we can first write our functional tests in Cypress to make sure that buttons are there, that this no active projects message is displayed in case we have no projects, so the functional level. Then we can let just snapshots or story shots do the structural level of our components in a very easy way, because we have to do the showcasing to be able to do proper styling and testing in Storybook anyway. And then we can just reuse our stories to make sure with just snapshots to have a first very fast feedback loop on did we change something that we did not intend to change. And also we collect test coverage and gain the information, did we cover everything we have to cover with our Storybook instance. And then we do the snapshot testing, the visual regression testing with Loki, that in combination with the full test coverage by the just snapshots can give us full confidence that our UI components work exactly like we expect them to. Yeah, and that's it for my presentation. I hope you liked it, and I hope you have not been too disappointed that we did not directly touch Cypress. Cypress has another very interesting layer for testing React components that I would like to show in the next webinar. But as you can see, we're at minute 53 of 60, and yet another topic would not have fit in. So I'm looking forward to cover the next part in our next webinar. And I think now it would be time for Q&A. Philip, do we have anything?
Yes, indeed. We already have one question lined up from Sean. He is asking, there seems to be a lot of manual effort to mock static queries from existing hooks. Is there not a simpler way to reduce this effort or abstract this for all stories versus making them too component specific? Understandable, per story you may want different data, but seems problematic having to recreate hooks all the time.
Yes, we actually use a pattern that I did not include in this webinar right now because it would not have fit in with time. But what we essentially do is we create a file called, for example, metadata.stubs.js. And there we put an default export function. This function essentially calls this stub metadata. And then in the Storybook preview.js, I would have to look up the exact code now, but in Webpack, there is this require context facility that allows us to scan our repository at runtime for specific files. And what we do then is scan for all metadata.stub.js files, or just all stub.js files, and execute their default export before each story. So we can be sure to have like the baseline of all stubs in Storybook everywhere. And then, so if use projects in projects would already have been stubbed at this point, we can, if we want a different result, we would do projects dot use projects. And since we know that it already has been stubbed by sign-on, we can just call returns again and return our different data. Let's copy. So this is very useful also if we have accumulated stories that use multiple components, and multiple components may use multiple hooks. So we make sure that we have for each hook that we extract, we have like a baseline stub that does the most common thing, like display 3 stories or display the metadata. And then we can selectively override this stub in the stories that need to. Did this answer the question?
It looks like it did. He says, wonderful news. Thanks for clarifying. That is a great solution. We've got 2 other questions that came in the meantime. The first one is from Robert. He's asking, is there a way to create stub data once to be shared across the various testing programs. So creating one file of what should become back from the API that can be used by Jest, Storybook, Cypress, etc.
Yes, that's what we already also showed. We have in Cypress fixtures this examples.js. This is now used by this first stub, because it just imports from this examples file and uses it to stub it. And at the same time, we also have this mock API GraphQL server for end-to-end testing that also uses this file. And you could as well just import it into a Jest unit test. It does not matter. So this can be imported. As long as you're running with JavaScript, you can import it anywhere. If you're having different technologies, like there is also PHP involved, you could just store this data in a YAML or JSON file and read it from there.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Philip. Marius is asking, how do you deal with technical differences in the stacks of your application and Storybook? Do you keep them in sync, and how? Or how do you get confident the components work the same way to different stacks?
I'm not completely sure what this means. So would this mean that we have like a component that is used in a completely different environment? So as long as we're using React, we're always in JavaScript land. Or what? Yeah, perhaps you can elaborate more closely what different stacks would mean.
Mm-hmm. Just waiting on feedback from Marius if something's coming in either the chat or the Q&A. I mean more about different Webpack, Babel configs, and things like that.
Okay, yeah, well, that's Webpack config is black magic anyway. But yeah, we try to centralize as much as possible. But there are some gotchas, because Cypress is using its own Webpack config, and Storybook is using its own Webpack config and application too. And it's hard to like automatically keep it 100% in sync. So what we try to use is a centralized Babel configuration that all of these use, for example, or what we did not do here, but in our projects, we run everything on TypeScript. And then at least the JavaScript transpilation is pretty much aligned. Not 100%, but it's closer than having 3 different Babel configs.
Okay, that is currently the end of the Q&A queries that are open. If there's anything else that you would like to address, we're going to give you another 30 seconds quickly.
Oh, there is a new question in the chat that I've just seen.
Did I skip something?
Yeah, the last one from Shweta. Since Cypress also supports visual testing with plugins, Applitools, Percy, and Hippo, what causes you to go with Jest and Loki? At best case, we use both, but they serve different purposes. So in Cypress, we can model our whole application flow, and we can do selective snapshots. For example, in Percy, we did not use Hippo or Applitools yet, but Percy. But there's a lot of effort to be sure, and you never can be sure to cover everything. And with Jest and Loki, we can use code coverage metrics to make sure that we covered all our front-end UI code within Storybook components. And so we were stubbing out hooks, but the hooks also should have just unit tests. So our code coverage in the end can tell us if we exposed all our different UI variants and states through Storybook. And then we also can be sure that Loki captures all of them. And that's one reason, because with doing targeted snapshots from Cypress, we have more control, and we can also snapshot specific edge cases, and also then in combination with Percy, which is actually accessible and approvable by product owners, for example, in their web UI, which we can't do with Loki. So that's basically a different level of testing. And the other reason is Percy costs per screenshot, and we don't want to compromise on basically cost of testing and our proper structure of the Storybook and the UI components. So if we have a project with a lot of components, several hundred components, every commit would do a lot of screenshots just to be safe into Percy, and that's just a cost factor. So we try to use every tool where it fits best.
All right, that seems to be answering Greta's question as well. I see nothing else in the Q&A pipeline. I think in the light of the time, we should wrap this one up. Should you have any further questions, however, please feel free to turn to webinars@amazy.com, and we'll be attending your queries afterwards and passing those open questions to Philipp. And as I mentioned in the introduction to this presentation already, we'll be doing our very best to work on the full recording of this presentation and make this available to you in the next couple of days. In the meantime, you can turn to our YouTube channel for the 2 other series items in the test-driven development series, and get watching over there. Thank you, Philipp, for presenting, and thanks to all of you for being in the audience listening in for the last hour. We hope to be able to see you in the next edition again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.